welcome to Canonical. I'm James Shao, and with me, as always, are Sam Spieler and Iad Darris.
Aloha.
I knew you were going to change it up.
I always try to change it up just a little bit, just enough to give you a taste of something different. So today we are continuing our series on the impossibility of a new home with Yuri Herrera's Signs Preceding the End of the World. If this is your first time, you can join our book club on Reddit at Canonical Pod. We discuss these books every Friday, and you can find that link by going to our episode description. We are also on social media at Canonical Pod, all one word. And if you want to support us in your local bookstore, you can use our bookshop.org link, which is also in our episode description. In this episode, we'll be discussing spoilers. If you have not read the book yet and you don't want the ending spoiled for you, you can check out our review episode, which was published last week. Next week, we will be continuing our series with Austerlitz by W.G. Siebold. We hope you'll join us for that one as well.
So I guess I'll start here. Machina describes herself when discussing her role as the switchboard operator early on in the book. She calls herself the door, not the one who walks through it. How do you understand this in the context of the rest of the novel?
It's a bit ironic because she ends up being someone who has to walk through the door. Was that how you understood it?
Yeah, but I think there's more to it than just the literal walking, the literal passing from one place to another. I guess what I'm getting at is the translation that's going on of herself and of the world around her. Like, what does it mean for her to be a door versus not a door?
I think that her initial view in the beginning of the novel is that a person could be a conduit. A person could have a neutral kind of experience that doesn't change them. And I think that that belief is proven wrong when she travels to this other place and the experience changes her. So the idea that somebody could just be a door is proven incorrect.
Yeah, I think so too.
Well, here I want to ask a similar question. So
Sure.
she is this door, right? Like she's trying to serve communication between people as a switchboard operator. She goes to find her brother because her mother, Cora, has given her a note. She travels all the way to where her brother is, and she doesn't even give him the damn note.
Oopsie.
What's up with that? Why doesn't she give him the note?
I wasn't sure about that either. That seemed very odd to me. The only thing I took away from that is that it felt pointless at that point because her brother had more or less decided, or his path had been decided for him, and that she had a taste of how this land changes a person. I just assumed she took it to be a pointless gesture.
I'm finding the content of the note here. The actual note that her mother gives her says, "Come on back now," it said in Cora's crooked writing. "Come on back now. We don't expect anything from you." So the note doesn't seem to be particularly profound. It seems to not have a particular emotional appeal or any sort of intellectual appeal as to why he should come back. So it seems like Makina has judged it insufficient to draw him back from his new life. But if the novel showed us a different note, do you think she would have delivered it? Or do you think, as the title of our series indicates, that it would be impossible? Like, no note would be good enough? What if she said specifically, like, hey, you don't need to pretend to be a soldier. I think you'd be more comfortable living at home. I'd like to be closer to you as well. Please come back home. Would that have been worth delivering?
So, in my reading, I don't think the content of the note matters at all. I think what happens is she meets her brother, and her brother has become a new person. So, there is no point I mean, when she first meets him, she says that she barely recognizes him. We find out he assumes this other identity, and then he decides he doesn't want to go back anyway. And by the end of their interaction, we get the sense that she's probably not going to see him again, that something's been severed. So it's almost as if he's a new person now, and you wouldn't give him the note because that note wouldn't have any meaning to him. He's a different person. That's how I read the choice not to give him the note. And then when she reads it, the note is for her. It's telling her to go back.
That's interesting. I had never considered that.
I hadn't either.
I think that the same thing that happened to her brother is going to happen to her. I don't think that it is a selective experience. I think it's a universal experience.
Yes.
Yeah, that's why I think this double reading, like the note is actually for her, makes sense to me. We don't even know if that was Cora's intention, that she knew by giving her this note that Machina will also have to make a choice. But maybe Cora knows that this note is actually for both of her children. I like that reading just because I think it makes the ending more interesting, more complex than just her deciding not to give her brother the note.
So the name, I kind of danced around it a bit in the last episode, but I think her name is a very intentional name. I've been pronouncing it Machina because I think there is some play there with machine.
For our Anglo listeners, it should be noted that machina means machine in Spanish.
Even if it's not spelled the same way. She does operate as this conduit of sorts, or at least she, like you said, she thinks of herself as this conduit. Even if that proves to be not a fully effective way of looking at herself, she does go through several different kinds of translation. She also feels very hollow in some ways. Like she is a very mythic character. She's not a fully fleshed human, as we discussed in the last episode. She doesn't feel mechanical to me, but she does feel, well, like not a real human, let's say. She feels like a character.
Do you think then that her role in the novel is more of a functionary rather than a being with agency?
Well, kind of to what James was just saying, how her journey is not a singular one. This is something that is almost inevitable. Almost. It happens to so many people, even if they have the intention of coming back. Like early on, she talks about, I should say the narrator talks about how she sees it so often that someone comes back, but either they've changed so much and don't recognize their home, or they come back seemingly the same, but everything has changed at home to them. That there is this inevitability of becoming a different person, regardless of whether you actually return, but that the returning doesn't always happen either. So I think, yeah, she does fill this kind of functionary role.
That was actually one of my favorite passages in the book. Was it in the same passage as the guy coming back with the cell phone?
With the phones, I think it was in that same area.
That was kind of funny, but at the same time, it once again showed that she was so smart she knew how cell phone towers worked and he didn't. How come she knows and he doesn't know? Like, okay, I can understand if she knows because she's educated, right? But why doesn't he know?
At the beginning of chapter 2, there's talking about how you shouldn't get captivated. Be careful about not getting captivated. I think there's a lot of play with that as well. This allure of the land, of the US.
Well, this is something that we've been talking about a lot. Like, we keep calling it the US or we keep calling it Mexico. I don't think that's exactly right.
Well, that's kind of the part 2 of my question. It's a related question. There are only 3 people that have real names in this book. Machina, Cora, her mother figure, and Chucho, who is one of the guides that helps her across.
Coyote.
Right, a coyote of sorts. Everyone else are given by initials like Mr. H or Mr. P, or they're given more generalized names. And the same thing happens with place identification. We get the big Chilango, which you could probably take to mean Mexico City, but not necessarily. I forget what she calls the big river, but you can take that to be the Rio Grande. And then the north is pretty obviously the US, but I think there's something to the idea of making it these mythical names or using mythical locations like, what is it, the Obsidian Mountain or something like that? Obsidian Hill. She's at one point, she describes a baseball diamond, and it sounds like this sea of grass. What effect does that have on the story or of your understanding of it?
I think it just contributes to that distancing that I was talking about in the previous episode. Herrera is very clearly wanting to avoid talking about Mexico as Mexico and America as America because everybody thinks they know so much about those places already. How can we avoid that by calling them by their names? How can we avoid these character types by saying that they speak English or Spanish, like you have to say that they speak Latin or Anglo? Like, it's a very difficult territory that he's trying to investigate here because it is so overwrought already. People have so many ideas about it already. How can you make it mythic? How can you make it symbolic and substantial in the way that he wants to?
Well, and you mentioned two languages, but there's a third too.
Right.
There's the native language.
Yeah, I'd take that probably to be Nahuatl, right? Like, she knows all three languages, so that puts her in a prime position. But I think it's not necessary to be specific about what these people are actually, but rather what they represent.
Yeah, I think that went a long way for me making it this big mythical journey, or as James pointed out, it's the quest story. It makes it this larger than life kind of thing.
What I would be very curious to learn is how different groups of migrant people respond to this type of story because it has been distanced in this way. For example, I'd be very curious how the Polish population in England would respond to this because they are often similarly maligned in the same way that the Mexican population in the US is maligned. Like, I feel like it becomes resonant because it's distanced from what you think about Mexicans, but I would actually like to see that firsthand.
Yeah, or the Syrians in France or something.
Yeah. I think that they would latch on to it because I think there is a universal aspect to this experience, which it's easy for anybody who has traveled, especially from a less developed to a more developed place. It's an easy experience to understand.
I think the other purpose it serves is it disorients the reader and it puts the reader in the shoes of the migrant, someone who doesn't know the names of what's around him, someone who doesn't know everything that's going on. So it serves a purpose in putting the reader in the shoes of a migrant. For me, that's a very important part of the book. Is I think one of the goals of the book is to force the reader to experience what the migrant experiences.
That reminds me of the section, maybe about 2/3 to 3/4 of the way through the book, when she's told that she has to go like 3 towns over.
Yeah.
But she explains how it doesn't feel like she's crossing any borders, that it's just one big blend of strip mall type places. And I had to reread some of that section to try and picture what she was seeing and try to make sense of it. But I can picture all of these, especially newer towns along the borders in, Southern California or especially Texas, where everything looks the same and there's a lot of new residential neighborhoods with probably very few trees. Everything just looks alike and stamped out.
So earlier, I was just talking about how this narrative is probably very resonant with people of other migrant groups, but there is something that I think in this novel is very Mexican. That is, I think that the journey that Makina goes on is very much in parallel with the soul's journey to Mictlan in the Mexica mythology. Mexica or Aztec. There is some debate over the terminology. I'll use Mexica only because Aztec is a foreign name for these people, but there is a subtle difference that we might talk about on Reddit. Basically, the novel has several chapters that seem to have these very oblique titles that Sam was mentioning about, like obsidian mounds and winds and things like that. In this mythology, when people die and they travel to the underworld, they have to take a 4-year long journey. And at the end of the journey is the place where their soul can be at rest. But there is a crossing of the river, just like Makina crosses a river. There is a chapter called something like Two Mountains, or the place where hills meet. That's also part of this mythology. So it's very clearly drawn from this mythology. It seems very clear that when Makina travels to this America, which is not really America, she has died. And at the beginning of the novel, she actually says, I am dead. So, what does this mean? Like, she seems to be staying in America at the end of the novel. Her brother seems to be staying in America at the end of the novel. What does that mean?
Well, we already talked about how they've become new people. They go through a change, not just in how they see themselves, but new identities, completely new identities as the state sees them. When she talks about language, there's this fascination with how the Anglo and the Latin work together to create some new thing. But it also seems to describe it as a death of the old, like a death of where they came from.
That's kind of how I read it as well, where in this journey that he likens to death, it is a transformative journey. It's the death of the person who's leaving.
Why do you think specifically, though, that he grafts this tale onto their death mythology? Like, why is it specifically paralleling the underworld in this way, though?
For me, it's this kind of intertwining that happens throughout the novel, where he mixes together something that is very old with something that is very contemporary, and he mixes together two worlds. The book seems to do this, and I wouldn't say it does it frequently, but it does it consistently. She is always, as we mentioned before, the conduit. So she's kind of placed in the middle. But to be placed in the middle, you have to have things on either side. So it's this constant mixing and blending that goes on. Yeah, when you research these 9 stages or levels, did you go back and see if they matched up with different parts of the book? Or is it a one-to-one likeness?
It's not exactly one to one. I think that it is maybe 70% on the nose. Like, it is very clear how the parallels work, especially with the titles of the chapter. And I think that it's clear enough that a reader of that heritage would recognize it. And I think that's what I'm trying to get at is it is a migrant story, but I think it is in this instance very specifically a Mexican migrant story. And I think that, a Mexican reader would find it much more resonant only because the experience of death is understood, I think, very differently in Mexican culture than it would be in another culture. I think it's very important that this is not paralleled with a culture that believes in reincarnation because Makina's journey and her brother's journey is to a place where you don't come back. But even though they don't come back, there is still a presence. And I think that we see that presence in Mexican culture in a holiday like Dia de los Muertos. Like the dead are gone, but they still have a relationship with the living through memory and through service. Every Dia de los Muertos, Mexican people will prepare ofrendas for their deceased, right? So it's very similar, I would say, to the way that Mexicans in America still have a connection with the people back home, even though they're very distanced. They still send the remittance every month when they get paid. Like it's this connection, it's this presence that's also an absence, which I think is very specifically Mexican, even though a lot of this novel can be extended to migrants everywhere. In this case, I think it's very Mexican. And for the curious listener, we will link an article about these 9 stages in the show notes so that you can have a look on how the parallels work.
I want to know, I need to check this chapter again, but there's a chapter called The Place Where People's Hearts Are Eaten. And that would match up with a jaguar that eats people's hearts in the actual mythology.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about what chapter of the book that was.
Was that near the end?
It's chapter 7, so it's pretty far along.
It's the one with her brother, right? The military chapter.
Right. That's where the brother is in the army.
Yeah, I guess that would go along with heart being eaten.
Yeah, and the police officer is related to the wild beast in the mythology. So the wild beast, I believe, is the 7th stage, and it's the 8th stage in the novel, or the 8th chapter in the novel.
Yeah, it seems like everything gets pushed forward one. Like the first chapter is the Earth.
Yeah, I also think it's quite interesting, maybe not so important, but in the beginning of the novel, when she's meeting with these mobsters, one of the mobsters offers her a glass of pulque, which was actually part of the Mexica culture. It was used as a ritual drink and also a sacrificial offering. So her consuming this beverage, in fact, I think he demands that she drink the beverage. It's like now you're ready to sacrifice yourself for this mission.
And Chucho, the coyote, seems like a trickster figure, right? This is not exactly related, but also from mythology. Doesn't he seem like a trickster figure? He seems to be someone who's talking to the cops, and at the same time, he's a coyote.
Well, also that word means like dog or mutt, which goes along with that stage in the journey. The link that Ead will put in the notes talks about how the first stage consists of crossing this river with the help of a dog.
Yeah, I'd seen online that somebody said the reason why Mexican people often have such an affinity for dogs is specifically because of this part of their mythology. Like they believe that dogs are very helpful animals and they'll guide the soul through the underworld.
It's interesting, too, that that takes place at night, that scene when they cross the river. And it sounds like that's why you need the dog, is because the dog's color is the only way to see through the darkness.
So, in this reading of the book, when does she die? Is it when she gets shot? Or is it before that?
I think it's the very beginning.
Yeah, there's like a cave in.
Yeah, the sinkholes.
I'm not sure it needs to be a literal death
No.
because I think it's just the permanent transformation that migration offers a person. I think that's the thing that Herrera's pointing to, is that once this happens, you don't go back.
Right. But I'm just wondering where you think the actual death occurs.
Well, there is no actual death.
I mean, if you're reading this as someone dies and then goes on a journey, like where would that death occur?
I think, according to that mythology, it would be the very beginning, not only because she says that she's dead, but because the chapter is called The Earth. So that's where she starts. Once she crosses the river, she's already dead. So by the time the bullet comes into play, she's already dead.
Before we take a break, let's talk a little bit about the ending. What do you think is the significance of her brother becoming a soldier? Like, why a soldier? Why not something else?
I have a political reading, and I'm not sure if it's accurate to what Herrera might have in mind, but I think there is a tendency among, Anglo-Americans to ignore what Mexicans contribute to the society. And a lot of people don't realize that this sort of thing can happen. And in fact, it doesn't even have to be deceitful as it is in the novel. Like, non-citizens can become American soldiers.
That's a very legitimate path to citizenship.
It's just a way of showing that this contribution is often ignored. It's under the surface for most Anglo Americans, but it's there.
Yeah, that's something I also read in the book. And I think in the last episode, I said it was a little bit too contemporary for my taste. Not this specific instance, but the book as a whole was a little bit too contemporary. And so that was one of those instances where I thought, maybe I would have preferred it not be so directly relevant to American politics.
But besides that political reading, I think there's the more thematic reading where he's not himself anymore. He has to become somebody else. And I think that's the more interesting reading, in my view, at least.
Yes. And also the fact that he and other people, the family who asks him to take their son's place, how they assumed he was going to die. And he always says, he assumes he's going to die, and everyone's surprised he doesn't die. So once again, it goes to this kind of straddling of life and death in this novel, which is something that reflects the rest of the novel. I think he's an interesting character, actually, in my mind, much more interesting than her, because his role in the novel actually serves a lot of different purposes. Like you can read him in many different ways and they all kind of work together.
He's kind of in this limbo where he doesn't seem happy, but he also doesn't seem unhappy. Like he's got friends. He seems to be sort of indifferent to his role, but not upset, not angry, not sad. The only reason he seems sad is because she's there. It's like this tether to his old life.
The worst part about his character is when he says that thing at the end about like he's trying to figure out why people stay in this country. For me, that was a little bit too political.
I mean, the world of America in this novel is very black and white. It's very dull and gray. And the world of Mexico, or what we should call Mexico, but it's not really Mexico, is very vibrant and colorful. Even though Herrera doesn't spend a lot of time describing it, you have that feeling. And he feels very, very neutered in some way. Like it seems like something has been taken from him. And the way that I feel that is because he doesn't seem particularly happy to see his sister. Like she has traveled from so far to see him, and his reaction is very, very muted. And that to me is quite sad in a way, but it also seems to underscore this kind of idea that James is talking about. Like, he's not unhappy, but he doesn't really have the same emotional quality that he might have had in Mexico.
It goes along really well with the whole underworld and death imagery, that it's not just that he's changed, it's that there's very little agency, but it's a different sort of, again, it's not unhappiness, it's just this, like you said, muted.
And then at the very end, the book implies that Machina will also stay in America. That actually caught me by surprise. Not, obviously in the context of everything we're talking about, it shouldn't be surprising because she's died and she's going on this journey. But if you read this from a purely realist point of view, it doesn't make any sense to me that she stays in America. But I think Herrera is trying to shoehorn it in to make the book work on other levels. Is that how you also read this ending?
I wouldn't read it that way. I think that if you see the parallel of migration to death, you can see, well, of course she can't go back. She has to stay. But I think it works on the more realist level of the inevitability of migration when you have this disparity in terms of resources and money and access to what is thought of by most people as a quote unquote good life. Like, whether you want it to happen or not, people are going to go to the US. And whether you want to go back or not, you don't go back. And whether you want to or not, you're going to die. So the sense of inevitability, I think, is part of the theme that he's kind of showing at the end of the novel.
Yeah, that's how I saw it as well. I was a little surprised, but I read it pretty much the same way Iad did, that there is this inevitability. And it reminded me of stories I've read or heard on the news where people have ties to back home and they know that their family is waiting for them to come home, but it's almost like a trap, this lure of having a nice life. Circumstances have changed and they might even still have plans to return, but they don't know when that will be.
I mean, my own father, he moved to the US in 1971 and he stayed in the US for 40 years. And only after retirement did he decide to move back. So I think it's a challenging thing because even in his experience, he has gone back to his home, but he doesn't fit in the way that he thought he would. I think that when you leave your home after a certain period of time, home becomes this mythic place and you become a different person. You become a stranger at home and you become more like the people that you initially thought were outsiders.
I think the novel does a great job of making everything feel very alien. Even in the beginning, when we're talking about the different gangsters, there's still this sense of warmth. They all know each other. There's this professional understanding among them. And there's a comfort to that, even though there's danger, there's this level of familiarity. But then once she crosses into the US or the underworld or whatever you want to call it, there's no familiarity. From that point on, everything is dead or muted or, as Iad put it, gray and strange. Even something like, as I mentioned before, a baseball diamond. You have to really try to see what she's talking about in order to see exactly what she means. Everything seems so foreign and so odd.
Okay, let's stop for a break here. When we come back, we'll talk about reading this book in the context of Mexican US immigration. We'll be right back. Welcome back.
So we've talked a lot about the political sensibility of the narration, and I've talked a little bit about what I imagine Yuri Herrera's politics are like. But do you think that this novel is trying to suggest an attitude or promote an attitude about real life US and Mexican immigration?
I think it is asking us to be sympathetic. The politics we've talked about, especially in the last episode, I think that does suggest that we should rethink how we see this kind of migration, especially that one scene with the police officer seems to do a lot of heavy lifting And as we discussed, too much heavy lifting. But I think it is trying to make us empathetic.
I think by drawing this parallel to death, it actually normalizes the act of migration. Doesn't it feel that way to you? Like death is entirely natural, it's something that's inevitable. And migration here seems also inevitable. Like when you have this kind of inequality across regions, you're going to get migration. Like, for example, you have that character, the boy on the bus, who she then meets again at the restaurant. First, okay, huge coincidence, but all right, it's kind of a mythic epic tale, so I'll forgive it. But, the story of that boy is the story of like the everyman, the person who crosses the border, right? Like he undertakes a dangerous journey where there are a lot of chances where he could have died. Like there was a part of the book where I think one of the coyotes was just going to use him as bait or something. And then you find him having achieved what he wanted, getting to his destination, and he's just working in a kitchen. So to me, it just normalizes it. And I think that's fine. And I think probably it should be normalized because it's going on all the time. We just kind of put it whatever the opposite of a pedestal is. We stuff it in a closet or put it in the basement and try not to talk about it or look at it too closely.
Well, and also by removing place names and things and making it this myth, it both elevates it to something epic, but also makes it more generalized, kind of in the way that you're talking about. But also, even though the subtext is Mexican US immigration, it can be generalized into something more just any migration.
Well, I don't know what your politics are on this issue, but it's a nuanced issue. Like, we don't all probably feel the same way. Is this persuasive? Is it challenging your views in any way? Because for me, I would say it's not. It's not persuasive at all.
I don't think it's really challenging anything about the way I think, but it also doesn't feel that persuasive. Like even if I'm trying to see from the other side, and I don't know that I would be persuaded.
Yeah, I'm not sure if the goal of it is to persuade. For me, it's more of a presentation than an argument.
But does that presentation affect your way of thinking about the issue at all?
I don't think it affects it enough, or I don't think it affects people's view of the issue enough to change any minds. Do you think there's enough here to change minds?
What I think robs it of that rhetorical power is the presentation of the police officer. Because we see this anti immigration perspective embodied in such a loathsome character, it almost feels unfair. It takes as given that opposition to immigration is wrong. And I particularly don't feel like barriers to immigration are just. I think that we do need to have a sensible immigration policy that's open to people that we depend on in this country. But because it's so broad and simple, I almost feel upset by it. I feel like it's not a fair rhetorical gesture to caricature and strawman this other viewpoint so broadly.
Well, and it's hard to take seriously too. That
Yeah.
scene in particular is very hard to take with anything more than a grain of salt.
What do you think is the purpose of that scene? Is it to preach? Is that the only way you can read it?
It's the sense of justice that I mentioned in the last episode. If you read the text of what Makina writes, it is quite powerful and quite moving. And you have the sense that this kind of bully who has been bullying these downtrodden people is finally hearing what he needs to hear. And that is very appealing. And I think maybe Yuri wants to say this to these people and he's never had the opportunity, or the reader that he thinks he's going to have wants to hear people saying this to this type of person. So he gives it to them.
Yeah, I'm wondering if there's anything more than that. Like, that's also my reading, and it's a very surface level reading, and that's what I think is what we dislike about it. It's just too simple. Can there be any possible other reading of this?
I mean, it concludes with "we the barbarians." So it's not necessarily Makina putting herself and her group on a pedestal, but rather just saying, look, we are the people who are responsible for the way society is right now, but we also contribute a lot of the things that you want in your society about cleaning the streets and cooking food and things like that. Like, it's a very realistic depiction of migrants in America, but it's not a realistic depiction, on the other hand, of the anti immigrant point of view. So you have this very eloquent rhetoric from one side and this caricature from another.
So, how complex do you think this book actually is? Like, is it complex?
I think what makes it complex is the mythology. I think that's what makes it interesting. I think if you removed that and made it one of those stories that we are more familiar with, it would just be lost in the noise. It would just be another one of those stories. But I think what saves it is the mythic quality.
Yeah, I've been talking about the rhetoric, but I don't think the rhetoric matters that much because, this is an emotional novel. This is not an intellectual novel. It does very well to show you the experience of somebody moving to a new place. It doesn't need to show us the debate over whether or not that movement should happen. And I think if we didn't have that particular scene in that particular presentation, it would be even stronger.
Well, and that goes to something that we were talking off air about before we were recording this, that there are certain things you could probably remove from this, and it probably would be stronger. James, you were saying that if you removed the more timely things, if you removed the 2020-ish, the things that have been happening in the past 10 years or past 15 years, that it would probably be a much stronger book. The overtly political things, if you took those out.
Yeah, I'm right.
Looks like you get the last word again.
Well, with that said, let's conclude now. Thanks for listening. Next week, we will be reviewing the second book in the series, Austerlitz by W.G. Sebald. We've also got an updated reading schedule, which is on Reddit. That subreddit is at Canonical Pod. We post threads for our book club discussion every Friday. If you'd like to talk about the topics we just discussed or about trying to navigate life in a new home or country, you can find us there. We'd love to hear from you. And if you find yourself enjoying this podcast,
I mean, who wouldn't?
go ahead and give us a nice review on Apple or your podcast platform of choice. You can make a suggestion for us. Tell us what you'd like us to read. Till next week, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.